This week on Just Solutions, we look at the climate crisis. Scientists are warning of catastrophic consequences if we continue with the current climate crisis trajectory. Meghan Schneider of Climate Power 2020 joins us to discuss what bold action the Biden administration needs to take to tackle the climate emergency. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Meghan, it's good to have you with us today. Well, 4 years ago, climate scientists were warning that 4 years of inaction would lead to irreparable damage to the climate. What we've had under the Trump administration is not just inaction, but active deregulation, a rolling back of existing climate safeguards. And so now we're at the start of a Biden administration. It seems that we have so much damage repair to deal with. Take us through exactly where we are right now under a Biden administration and how much work we need to do, considering the last 4 years and considering we weren't even in a great place at the start of the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here. I think we could spend all day talking about the ways in which the Trump administration really set us back, and not only set us back, but also, added fuel to the fire of the climate emergency. He wasted valuable time in the fight against the climate crisis and sped it up by gutting environmental protections, denying science at every turn, and killing clean energy jobs across the U.S. I think that the EPA is one of the starkest examples of the ways in which he really set us back. Weeks after taking office, Trump gutted the EPA. He wanted to roll the budget back by 30% and cut 20% of staff. And that attack is really something that we didn't see him do on any other agency. And he continued that throughout his 4 years in office. And the science denial also is connected with COVID, which is so top of mind for everyone, a year into the pandemic. And that also cross-cuts with environmental issues, because of his environmental inaction and, allowing polluters to pollute with impunity. Communities that are experiencing this pollution were actually more likely to get sicker from COVID and even die at higher rates. So everything ties back to the environment, and we're so excited that voters demanded the bold climate action that we so desperately need after Trump's presidency. And, Biden has really made climate a focal point, both in the campaign and upon taking office. We've seen it with his appointments of his cabinet. Different people at the highest levels of his administration have huge climate records. And we're really excited about this new chapter.
Well, we're going to examine a lot of that, particularly some of the appointments to those critical agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. But I think the election of Joe Biden, and not just the federal elections, but indeed state and local elections around the country where progressive candidates ran very much on a platform of addressing the climate crisis, shows that this is something that voters are very concerned about as well.
Definitely. And I think that 2020 was really a turning point. For a while, elected officials were kind of wary to talk about climate, especially in certain parts of the country. And I think, for all its ups and downs, 2020 really showed us a preview of the climate crisis and what inaction looks like. We saw the worst wildfire season in history, the worst hurricane season in history, some of the hottest temperatures ever recorded. And so people were living with the reality of climate crisis, and they, saw kind of what lies ahead if we don't take bold action right now. And so that translated at the ballot box, and they elected climate candidates, like you said, at every level.
Well, let's take us through some of the appointees that Biden has made for his cabinet and other positions, particularly some of those regulatory agencies. Because in December 2020, Biden announced his climate team. One of those that we have already talked about many times in Just Solutions, Deb Haaland, the first Indigenous woman to head up a cabinet. She's now the Secretary of the Interior, really lauded that position by so many people very excited about that. But as you said, there are many other agencies, many other positions. Take us through some of the other people that environmental activists are very pleased that Biden has put into key positions when it comes to the climate crisis.
Definitely. Like you mentioned, Secretary Haaland made history as the first Indigenous person and Indigenous woman to head a cabinet agency. And that is, so exciting, both for the history and also for what it means for climate. She has such a strong record of fighting for environmental justice and really holding polluters accountable. And I think that she's going to do great work in that role. But kind of, broader than the Department of Interior, Biden really prioritized climate at every level of the cabinet in a way that I don't think we've really seen in past presidencies. Just to kind of back it up a little bit, climate change isn't just, affecting the Department of Interior. It's a national security issue. It drives migration trends. It has huge economic implications. And I think Biden has a really firm understanding of that. And it shows in his appointment of people. Mayor Pete Buttigieg was appointed as Secretary of Transportation, and that is huge to have a climate person heading transportation, because the transportation sector is the largest source of emissions in this country. And so he and his climate record are going to be able to reduce emissions and really build this resilient, modern infrastructure and clean energy framework that we so desperately need. I was going to also say, kind of on the more international side of things, people like Secretary of State Blinken and John Kerry, who is the president's special envoy for climate, are also going to play a huge role in this kind of all of government approach, and really show the world that the U.S. is back and we're serious about climate change, and we want to work with international partners to come to solutions.
We'll talk more about infrastructure in a moment, because that's such a key, connector between the economy and the climate crisis. As you said, the climate crisis is impacting so many different aspects of society. And if we just talk really about the economics of all of this, I mean, the cost of the climate crisis on infrastructure, there's a huge cost associated with that. The economic imperative to address this now is undeniable. Now, your particular website, Climate Power, has some very stark statistics about the economic cost of this, let alone the human and the health costs, but the actual economics of the climate crisis. Take us through some of that.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think so often when we talk about climate change, we talk about the cost of action, but it's really important that we also talk about the cost of inaction, because the climate crisis is going to cost us whether we act or not. And the fact is that inaction it has a huge price tag. Two separate reports found that there could be up to a 10% loss in GDP annually in the US economy if we don't take climate action. And to put that into perspective, that's twice the impact of the Great Recession. And so this is really remarkable. It's not just the cost of inaction, but also, rebuilding from extreme weather and climate disasters. You also mentioned the human toll. I think, you really can't put a price tag on the devastation that so many people have faced, especially last year. We saw countless families fleeing the worst wildfire season on record, the worst hurricane season on record, all during a pandemic, which is just kind of wild to wrap your mind around. And it's only going to get worse. So it really is not an option to not act, and we have to act.
We'll talk more about that in just a moment, but we'd like to know where our viewers are watching us from right now. Let us know in the comments where you are and your thoughts on what's happening right now. As we have discussed, we've had 4 years of not just inaction on the climate crisis, but active deregulation of some of these very important safeguards around the environment. What are your thoughts on what's happening right now under the Biden administration? Now she says that she was disappointed by the appointment of Tom Vilsack for the Secretary of Agriculture. I know that many people were actually disappointed by that. She thought that it should have been Marcia Fudge. So it's not good news across the board. And I think what's really important, Meghan, is to, as you've outlined, that I think more people are becoming aware of, the climate crisis impacts every single sector of society, whether it's health, infrastructure, of course, agriculture, banking, finance, and that's a huge part of it too. And in fact, today we've seen protesters getting arrested in London for doing an action at Barclays Bank, raising awareness about the connection between big banks and the fossil fuel industry. We're seeing so many connections between the fossil fuel industry and these other powerful entities in society. At the same time, we're seeing environmental actions against that. The divestment movement has been incredibly successful in many different states too. I mean, take us through that again, just how the interconnectedness of these power structures with the fossil fuel industry and really what we're up against and why we need such a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the great news is that folks are really starting to realize what you just outlined. Climate change and these environmental issues touch every facet of life. And because of that, we need these really broad solutions, from agriculture to banking. Everyone has a role to play. And I think the good news is in the past couple of years, people are starting to see that while it's important that individuals do their part to, live a more sustainable life, really what's driving climate change is companies, fossil fuel companies who are polluting with impunity. And the good news is that we're starting to hold them accountable and people are onto it.
That idea of shifting the narrative away from personal responsibility to really examining the power structures that are causing so much of the climate crisis, because it does seem that for so long the narrative was on personal responsibility. What are you doing as an individual? Are you recycling? Are you walking instead of driving? We're now seeing a real acknowledgement that it's the structures that we really need to tackle. And of course, we need personal responsibility and individual action, but we need massive change at those structural levels as well.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it's classic blame shifting. It's a lot easier for companies to blame individuals who have a small role to play instead of taking responsibility for their own actions, which are what is, far and away the biggest driver of climate change. And the science tells us that that's true.
Well, Ed is watching us from Atlanta right now. He says that 2 trillion was insufficient to deal with the crisis right now. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I'm assuming Ed is referring to the COVID bailout, because that's very much connected, as you outlined earlier, Meghan, to what's happening with the climate crisis. In terms of what needs to be invested into tackling solutions and tackling the climate crisis, we're really looking at massive levels of investment that are needed.
Yeah, you're exactly right. In terms of infrastructure, we are so far behind. We haven't invested enough to simply maintain our infrastructure, let alone keep it modern. And so that's why we're really excited about President Biden's American Jobs Plan, because it outlines ways to modernize our infrastructure through investments in things like clean energy, but also rebuilding kind of the traditional physical infrastructure, things like roads, bridges, railways. And in doing so, it's going to create millions of good paying clean energy jobs. And these jobs come at a time when workers are really ready to get back to work. The pandemic has devastated our economy and millions of people are still out of work. And so this is really a great opportunity to create those good paying jobs while also making the investments that we need, which in turn will stave off the worst effects of climate change.
Well, let's talk more about the connection between the climate crisis and infrastructure, because even this year, we've seen it so starkly laid out for us, in Texas with the snowstorm and how the entire electrical grid came down. We've seen droughts in the ongoing drought and extreme heat in the American West impacting infrastructure and our electricity grid as well. And research showing that severe weather actually caused nearly 80% of the large-scale power outages from 2003 to 2012. That's only accelerating. And so what is the impact of the climate crisis on infrastructure right now, whether it's power supply systems to the internet, which of course so many people are now relying on because of what's happened with COVID. More people are working or being educated remotely, to the impact on dams and bridges. I mean, there's a very real connection between the climate crisis and physical infrastructure in this country.
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. I'm so excited that we're having this conversation about infrastructure and climate because they're inherently linked. Like you mentioned, the situation in Texas, this is a great example of what happens when we don't invest in our infrastructure. Leaders in Texas knew that they weren't ready for, a severe storm. They knew that this was going to happen, and they still failed to invest in weatherizing the grid. And as climate change progresses and we see, more extreme weather, more severe storms, we're going to see that situation play out again and again, not just in Texas, but in other parts of the country. And I think that was really a wake-up call for a lot of people about the need to modernize our grid. But beyond that, our infrastructure also contributes to climate change in many ways, which I think is something that we really need to be talking more about. And I'm excited this conversation is starting, now in the last couple of weeks. Our infrastructure is overly reliant on fossil fuels right now. And we know that these poison our communities and poison our planet. And beyond that, our cities are oftentimes designed in ways that trap this pollution and trap extreme heat, which exacerbate the effects of climate change and make people more vulnerable to extreme heat. And unfortunately, Black and Brown communities are hardest hit by those impacts. We know that 230,000 people die prematurely each year in the US just because of air pollution. And Black and Brown communities are more likely to live in areas with high air pollution, either because they're alongside, polluting facilities like chemical plants, or because they're by busy roadways where there's a lot of emissions. And so it's, it all ties back to infrastructure. There's so much to be said on this point.
Well, Ed in Atlanta has clarified that he's saying that the $2 trillion for the infrastructure plan was insufficient. He's talking about the infrastructure bill. When you outline, Meghan, that we need to completely overhaul our infrastructure, mend existing infrastructure. But as you said, so much of our infrastructure is contributing to the climate crisis. It does seem that $2 trillion might just be a drop in the bucket. I mean, do you see this as an initial investment? Obviously, this is something that we need to completely overhaul how we've structured our cities, structured our power grids. Everything needs to change, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a starting point. I think we're moving in the right direction, and this is far and away the biggest kind of overhaul we've seen for decades. And so we're really excited about the level of ambition outlined in this plan. And I think that, once we get the ball rolling, we'll continue to move towards cleaner infrastructure and more resilient infrastructure. It's certainly not an open and shut case.
Another aspect of infrastructure that really Biden has not really addressed are the pipelines. And of course, this has been a huge issue for so many people, and particularly Indigenous people in this country. The Dakota Access Pipeline is operating in violation of some of the laws that are actually in place. And we did see Indigenous youth rallying at the White House just the day after Joe Biden announced his infrastructure plan, calling on Biden to stop the pipeline and other pipelines as well. There's the other pipeline project, Line 3, that we're seeing a lot of activism directed at too. What are your thoughts on that? Because this seems to be something that we're not seeing a vocal response or policy response from the Biden administration.
Yeah, well, the White House has said that they're going to consider each project on its merits and take the full picture into account. We saw President Biden cancel the Keystone Pipeline. Dakota Access is still stuck in review. But I think, President Biden is really focused on building a cleaner and more modern economy. And in doing so, that means prioritizing investments in clean energy. President Biden knows that that's the direction that the world is moving in, and he wants the US to be number one in clean energy. And so I think it's really exciting that we're moving in that direction.
What about the opposition? Oh, apologies, Meghan. Please finish your thought.
No worries. I was just going to say, we talked a little bit about Secretary Haaland earlier, and I think that her appointment is also huge. Both Biden and Haaland understand the importance of bringing frontline communities, especially tribal communities, to the table to talk about the ways that these projects affect their communities and making sure that they're, part of these conversations.
Well, in terms of opposition to either the infrastructure plan or some of these goals around the climate, of course, we are seeing many members of the Republican Party opposing this. Deb Haaland's nomination was opposed by some Republican lawmakers. And in fact, Climate Power released a statement saying that those very same Republican lawmakers who were opposing the nomination of Deb Haaland to the Department of the Interior had big oil ties. I mean, we talked earlier about the connection between finance, fossil fuels, but of course there's massive political connection as well.
Yeah, you're totally right. The Republican efforts to, halt Haaland's nomination, it shows where their priorities are. Their priorities lie with their big oil donors. And that was on full display during the confirmation process. Ultimately, she was confirmed in a bipartisan way. And I think that, these Republicans were really trying to block her because they're scared. And the companies bankrolling them are scared. They know that Deb Haaland is someone who will hold them accountable, and that overall she will put every person's right to clean air and clean water above big oil profits. And that's something that scares them.
Well, Elizabeth, who's watching, saying that these large amounts of infrastructure, they're necessary to maintain a living nation. I mean, that's the essence of it. It's vital that there is an investment in infrastructure. And Elizabeth adds that pipelines should, in fact, be moving water. That's what we should be doing. Of course, water is a massive issue when it comes to the climate crisis and the ongoing pervasive drought in the American West. But I want to go back to a point that you made earlier, Meghan, about the disproportionate impact of environmental degradation and the climate crisis on communities of colour and how they need to have a seat at the table. Of course, we're talking about Deb Haaland being the first Indigenous person, Indigenous woman to head up such a cabinet position like that. But traditionally, even non-governmental agencies and environmental advocacy groups have not been fully representative of the groups that are most impacted. We've seen a lot of white leadership in these organisations and not enough space being made for the voices from communities that are directly impacted, those frontline communities living day to day the reality of global warming. Take us through why we need to have more representation and those voices being heard when it comes to policy making at the highest level, but also environmental groups as well that are working very often in a local way.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I think it's important to have a variety of voices, bringing different experiences and different perspectives to any conversation about any problem. But when you're talking about something with the magnitude of the climate crisis, it's even more important, especially because this is an issue that cross-cuts every facet of life. And a big problem requires big solutions. And the best way to do that is through inclusion, because that fosters innovation. we need everyone at the table because we need as many good ideas as we can get. And you mentioned that frontline communities are often, Black and brown communities are hit hardest by environmental injustice and climate change. So because they're living with these problems, they have a personal understanding of them in a way that other folks might not have. And I think that, oftentimes we see that these communities have community level solutions that they've developed while living alongside these problems. And so we should really be listening to them, learning from those community-based solutions, because these people are experts on these issues and how to mitigate the effects of pollution and other climate issues. Just to give a couple of examples of how the climate crisis disproportionately affects communities of color. Black people in the US are 3 times more likely to die from air pollution than white people. And they're 70% more likely to live in counties that violate federal air policy standards. And so when we talk about environmental justice, we're really talking about justice for these communities. Everyone has the right to breathe clean air, but unfortunately, that's not happening right now. And we're really excited to be working with diverse array of people, both at the national and state level, to bring all of these perspectives to the forefront. And I think that we've also seen with Biden's cabinet, it's a cabinet that looks like America. That's something that was really important to him. And, having folks like Secretary Haaland, Michael Regan at EPA, Brenda Mallory at the Council on Environmental Quality, these are all environmental justice advocates who have really real experience working with these frontline communities. And it's a great step in the right direction to have them leading the way.
And in terms of inclusion and including voices from communities directly impacted by the climate crisis, that extends to a global stage. And the US has not been a global leader. Of course, Trump, took the country out of the Paris Agreement. Biden has put us back into that. But even 4 years ago, under the Obama administration, many people felt that more could have been done for the US to be a global leader when it comes to the climate crisis. What about the US now on a global stage, and particularly acknowledging that there are many countries that are poor countries that are bearing the brunt of the fossil fuel consumption from more developed nations and from richer countries? And so how do we balance that as well and make equity a core part of our global approach to this?
Yeah, I think it tracks back to the last question. These small, often island nations are really facing disproportionate impacts from climate crisis. And so we need to listen to them and listen to the science, make sure they have a seat at the table, to be involved with the innovation and the solutions. President Biden, he rejoined the Paris Agreement on day 1 of being in office, but he's also been clear that we need to go beyond the measures outlined in the Paris Agreement. He's been very clear that he knows we can't solve the climate crisis on our own. And he's really committed to re-entering the US to this global conversation. And I think that's why it's so important. We have climate champions like Secretary of State Blinken and the climate envoy, John Kerry, kind of leading the way. I think next week or the following week, President Biden is hosting a summit on climate with more than 40 world leaders at the White House to talk about how we can work together towards climate solutions. And so it's really exciting to see this focus on kind of international collaboration and cooperation and diplomatic solutions to the climate crisis, because one country can't do it on their own.
Well, in the last just 20 seconds that we have, Meghan, we talked earlier about we need to look at the power structures when it comes to the climate crisis. But of course, personal action makes a big difference too. What are some good resources for people, viewers right now, to dig into when it comes to personal actions that we can all take? And we just have a few seconds left.
Yeah, I would say the number one thing is to talk to people in their personal lives about these issues, and really to continue the conversation about it being a structural issue. Personal responsibility is great, but we need to hold big oil accountable, and we need broad infrastructure investment like what we're seeing in the American Jobs Plan.
Well, Meghan Schneider, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, join us next week, same time, same place, where we're going to look ahead to Earth Day 2021 with Kathleen Rogers, who is the president of the Earth Day Network. That's on Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.